Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my recordings. In this recording, I am going to spend some time talking about something that I have observed for a couple of years. And I'll be honest, you probably have observed it too. And it is something that I'm just now starting to kind of frame up and put some context to, despite the fact that it's something that I've seen repeatedly, right? And that you've seen it. But here's the thing, we probably haven't invested any time, energy, and effort into understanding what it is that we were actually seeing. We were simply just observing it and just moving on, or observing it and making some assumptions based upon what we were observing and just moved on to something else. But in this video, in this recording, I want to put a little bit of context maybe to what it is that we've been seeing. And what I will say to you is that there is a chance that I could be wrong. There is always a chance that I could be wrong, but I want to try to put a little bit of context and texture to maybe what I have been witnessing, what you have been witnessing, and I would encourage you, if you agree, disagree, whatever it happens to be, down in the comment section. Let me know what you think. Let me know whether you think I'm off base, or maybe I'm on base. Maybe I am like headed towards some good stuff here, right? But I will allow you guys to be the judge after I kind of articulate what some of my thinking is here. But essentially what I'm talking about is, again, something that I have been observing since long before I had a YouTube channel. And it is something that not only have I observed, but something that I've maybe experienced as well. And so that's part of where some of my comments will come from, is from personal experience and conversations that I've had with people, et cetera, et cetera. So, but what I'm talking about and what you've probably seen are the unboxings. The CGC, CBCS, insert grading company here, unboxings that are everywhere in our community. And again, nothing wrong with that. I absolutely love a good unboxing. I do them myself. But one of the things that happens during these unboxings is that people are super pumped. Their graded comics have finally arrived from whatever grading company. They have arrived. They've been gone for whatever period of time. And now they're home, and now they are unboxing them, potentially on camera, potentially not. But if it's on camera, what essentially happens is that there's a ton of excitement as they pull out these fantastic books that they have spent their hard-earned money on, that they now have encapsulated, and they are great. They are back. They are good grades. They're modern stuff. They're pulling out 9.8s, and they're super pumped about it. And then it happens. What happens is they pull out something other than a 9.8, and that's when the mood of the entire video starts to change. Their body language, their facial expressions, their voice, their tone, the tenor. It all starts to change because there is something other than a 9.8 that has been pulled from the box. And those folks that are, purist, those folks that are like the anti-slappers will say that we have a bias towards anything that is less than perfect, and that our bias is driven by the financials. And I'm going to be honest, I think that the money is part of what people are experiencing. Maybe not the way that everyone thinks about it, but I think that money is a part of it. But in addition to money and finances and some of that stuff that I'll talk about, I believe that there are other emotions that are being displayed. There is confusion, there is surprise, there is shock, there is bewilderment. And in some cases, there is downright anger that is being displayed on these videos that we have watched. And again, I think some of us have watched it and just dismissed it, or we've watched it and we've chalked it up to one thing or another. We've moved on, but we haven't spent time really trying to understand maybe what these people are experiencing, maybe even trying to understand what we are experiencing as well, which is why I am doing this video, to maybe get us to think about some of this stuff a little bit different, because I think it's too simple to say that it's all about the money. I think that that's too simple of a response and an answer, because it's not always just about the money. There are other things that are being displayed on camera. There are other things that are being felt behind the scenes that, again, I want to try to dig into just a little bit. And with all of that said, maybe there is a bias or prejudice towards non-9.8 books, but it might not just be about the dollars. Maybe there are some other things at play there. And one of the things that I have come up with, one of the reasons that I have for the befuddled looks that we see, is the fact that there is a very, very small difference in many ways between a 9.8 and a 9.6, for example. There are minor hair's differences in many cases between a 9.8 and a 9.6. And I think sometimes people will look at these books and they will not quite understand why one book was a 9.6 and another book was a 9.8, when they may look sort of similar. And I think that there are a lot of factors at play. Right? We are talking about, yes, professional grading companies, and the expectation is that they get it right all the time. That is some people's expectation, but the truth of the matter is, it does not matter which grading company you are going with. There is a human element there, and humans make mistakes. That is important for us to acknowledge. And you would want to think that they have systems and protocols and things like that in place that allow them to make no mistakes. But the reality is that mistakes always happen. I have never worked anywhere where mistakes didn't happen. The question becomes, how many mistakes? How bad are the mistakes? How do you fix the mistakes? And how do you make the mistake right with me as the customer? Those really become the questions. It's not about, are you 100% accurate all the time? Because that is impossible. It is impossible for that to actually happen, right? So the expectation that someone never makes a mistake is just not reality. That is a false premise. And so I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that. But the other thing that I think is at play here again is that there are very, very small, minute differences between 9.8s and 9.6s, right? And one of the things that I think might be at play here is the fact that some grading companies will actually grade on a curve. Some grading companies will either look at a book and it is black and white, it is right or wrong. Others will say, you know what? We see this type of defect so many times that we are going to ignore it. We are going to close our eyes and we are going to pretend that that defect does not exist. And sometimes they do that for an entire range of books. So modern books, some grading companies will say wavy paper, forget about it. You can still get a 9.8 with wavy paper because of the production process that is associated with modern books. Wavy paper, A-okay. The same way that they have grandfathered in distributor overspray, grandfathered in. No big deal. That's not a big deal. We're going to close our eyes and pretend that that doesn't exist because there's nothing you have done to that book as a buyer, as a collector, that affected that grade. That is part of the production process, the distribution process. We are going to ignore that, right? That's sometimes what happens. Another thing that happens is that sometimes when a defect affects a run of books, and by run I mean it affects a lot of books, right? A lot of books, maybe even just a title, maybe even the books that were run for a given month. For example, right? This is an example. They will say, because this defect that we are seeing consistently is widespread, and it is not caused by improper handling by a collector or purchaser at a local comic shop, we are going to ignore it. We are going to grade this book on a curve. So what could happen potentially is that you have one book that is being graded on a curve because the defect that is being seen is widespread, and you have another book that may have that same defect where they are counting that defect on this other book, because on that other book, that defect does not affect the entire run. It just affects the book that is in your hand. And the defects could be the same. They could actually be the same type of defect. And I'm giving a hypothetical example here, right? So hopefully people get that. That sometimes an entire run's defects will be ignored, but that same defect on an individual book of another title at, whatever, another publisher might not be ignored because that defect is only with that book. And so that could be something that is viewed by the casual observer as inconsistency in what someone is doing. And the truth is it inconsistent, or is it very much consistent? I don't know. I really don't. But part of me is like, you know what? I like the fact that some grading companies will grade on a curve, because I think back, and this is an example that I use a lot. Amazing Spider-Man 800. I remember going to 3 different comic shops, and in one comic shop, I literally went through their entire order from Diamond. Every single book that I found at all 3 shops, and including in the one shop's entire box, their entire order, every single book had a bindery tear. Every single book had it. Now, if they had not graded on a curve, that book could have never received a 9.8. But thankfully they did, because they acknowledged the fact that that bindery tear was a known defect that have happened with that particular title, and they allow for it. Again, these are just examples that I'm giving that I'm hoping will frame up for people how there may be some things that look a little bit different from book to book, right? That are allowable on one but not allowable on another. This is not about inconsistency in grading, because that is a popular topic right now. And that is a complicated topic. In my opinion, that is a complicated topic, because anything that appears and where people want to summarize it in a single statement or something like that, I struggle with those type of things, because oftentimes things are much more complicated and complex than they appear. And when you try to simplify it too much, you oftentimes ignore really important facts and you don't allow for other viewpoints that may be counter to yours, that may also be just as right as the argument that is being made. So this is not about inconsistency in grading. This is more about helping people to understand how there are minute differences between 9.8s and 9.6s, and sometimes those differences are actually because of an actual reason. So hopefully that helps. But this 9.8 versus 9.6 is one of the things that in my mind will lead to a little befuddlement on the part of some people. One of the other things that I've been thinking about is this idea of getting comics back where there are no grader's notes. I honestly don't understand why any grading company would provide a comic back to someone without some type of justification as to why that book received the grade that it did. Because if someone sends in a book that they believe is a 9.8 and it comes back something other than that, there should be, in my mind, some justification as to why that book did not receive a 9.8. And again, there are hair's differences between 9.8s and 9.6s, but still, you should be able to name that hair. You should be able to explain fingerprint here, crease here, spine tick here, whatever it is. I think that the confusion that is being experienced by people who are looking for 9.8s and getting something other than that could be improved with grader's notes that tell them exactly what the defect was. Now, that does not make it easier for anyone to say, I get it, I understand it, but at least now you can point to something and say, okay, that's it. That's the reason. That's what they saw. Let me look to see if oh yeah, there it is. I see it. Okay. I don't like it, but it is what it is, right? The Grader's Notes will go a long way towards that. Now, what I will tell you, and this is based upon my experience of submitting books, and I have submitted a lot of books. One of the things that I will tell you is that I don't think that I have ever submitted a book that I expected to be a 9.8 that came back lower, where I wasn't able to look at that book and see why it was lower. I've sent in books where I'm like, I want that to be a 9.8. Or secretly, I know that that's not going to be a 9.8. But sometimes, my philosophy is sometimes you take shot on goal. Sometimes you take shot on goal and you see whether the defect that you see on that book is something that is going to be grandfathered in, or whether it's going to be something that they catch and there's like, yeah, that's actually a defect. That is not a printer defect or a distributor defect. That is a handling defect, right? I've taken those shots on goal. When the book comes back, I look at it and I'm like, yep, well, they caught that. That's a 9.6. I agree. Part of the reason why I think that I'm able to send these books in and kind of get them back and know, yeah, that wasn't a 9.8. Part of the reason why I know that is because I actually spend some time examining my books before I send them in. And this is not something that I've always done. And this was a hard lesson where I had to learn it, man, where I've sent in books and I sent them in and I never even took them out of the plastic. Never even took them out of the plastic. Looked at the front cover, perfect. 9.8 all day. Book comes back, 5.5. That is not an example. That is a true story. It happened. Never took some of my early books out of the plastic to examine them. And I learned the hard way. But what I do now is I literally take them out. I look them front, back. I look in the inside. And I've been not surprised as often by what actually comes back as a result of taking the time to actually look at these books in a little bit of detail. And one of the things that I do, especially with new books, is I actually stack the books together. I have multiple copies of the exact same book. I will stack them together and I will weed out those books that actually have defects. That is one of the things that I will do. Defect, no defect. If they have defects, they're automatically out because those books probably will not come back at a 9.8. In some cases, if the defects are numerous, they also won't come back at a 9.6. So that is one thing that I do, and it makes it easy because if you are looking at a single comic book in isolation, we as humans will have the ability to ignore negatives because it's in our best interest. We will see that book in the most positive light versus what that book actually is. But when you stack multiple books on top of one another that are all the same, you cannot help but identify the defects between those books. And sometimes what you will find is that all your books are defective because you're looking at them back and forth and you're seeing, well, that one has that, well, that one has that, this one has this. And before you know it, you've weeded all those books out as 9.8s. But sometimes what will happen is you will do that and you will find that one book does not have defects. It will appear to be perfect, right? And then that's the book that you end up sending in and keep your fingers crossed that it actually comes back at a 9.8. But again, if you're looking at a book in isolation, you will not necessarily want to see those defects. Therefore, you will not see those defects. It's like if you've ever written something, you write it, you read it, and it reads the exact way that you wrote it. But then someone else reads it and they're like, what is that word? What does that say? Because we have the ability as humans to fill in gaps and to bridge things and to make things be what we want them to be, because that's how our mind works. But if you are looking at it objectively, if you're looking at multiple books, you are less likely to embellish, right? And certainly when a third party is looking at it, they have no skin in the game. So they're like, yeah, that's a defect right there. That is not a defect that we see with other books. That is a defect to that book. That book is not a 9.8. That is essentially what happens. But when we are essentially evaluating our own books, we see them the way that we want them to be seen, and we send them in saying, this is a 9.8, and then it goes away, and then it comes back, and someone else has looked at it and just basically tells us, no, that book is not perfect. So one of the things that happens, I think, part of the bewilderment and the befuddlement is the fact that when we get those books back, are coming to terms with the fact that we made a mistake. We're coming to the realization that we missed something. And again, I cite my famous example of the 9.8 that I sent in. It came back at a 5.5. That was not the grading company's fault. That was my fault because I missed it. And so the befuddlement and the confusion that I feel sometimes is actually because I messed up, because I dropped the ball, because I wasn't paying attention. Now, none of this is to say that grading companies should be let off the hook for making mistakes. They should be held accountable. I am in full agreement with that. We want grading companies to be as perfect as they possibly can be. We don't want them to make mistakes. But again, if they do, because humans are involved, the question becomes, how do they make it right? Because mistakes will happen. They happen to everybody, including to us when we are sending books in. And again, I've sent books in, completely missed stuff. I've seen them one way and someone else sees it a completely different way, and then they point it out, and then what I feel is this uneasiness because I missed it, because I didn't see it, because I didn't pay attention, because I embellished what I was actually seeing. So there's a couple of things I think that are at play here, and it's not necessarily about the dollars and cents of it versus some of these other emotions which are manifest and being manifest on camera in many ways, sometimes even live, that we are trying to go through this range of emotions, sometimes that is directed at others, sometimes even directed at ourselves. There's a lot there. There's a lot there. The other part of it, and this is something that we alluded to, is that there is absolutely a financial component to this. There is no doubt about that. There is absolutely no doubt that there is a financial component to this, because despite the fact that there are hairs difference between a 9.6 and a 9.8 from a grade perspective, from a condition standpoint, there are oftentimes very large dollar differences between those two. And they get even worse as you go to a 9.4, a 9.2 and lower, right? In many, many cases, there are some big financial gaps between the various grades. So part of what is being manifested on camera is the fact that people are struggling with the fact that the book that they wanted to be a 9.8 has now been deemed to be something other than a 9.8, and they recognize the fact that there's money involved. They recognize the fact that that book did not come back where they wanted it to be, where they had hoped it would be, based upon them looking at that book and looking at that price in the pricing guide and realizing that book is $600 and the 9.6 is $50. That is a hard pill to swallow. And I'm laughing, but these are real things. These are real things that happen. And so it's really important that we take off the rose-colored glasses, if you will, when we are actually submitting books, and we actually look at these books as objectively as we possibly can before we actually send them in. And one of the things that I oftentimes recommend to people is that they actually, one, learn how to objectively look at a book and grade a book before they send it in. And there's a video on the channel here called Dirty Grading, in which I actually provide you with some tools and tips and pointers on how to do some dirty grading to evaluate the grade or condition of the book that you are thinking about sending in. And once you have done your dirty grading and you have a ballpark range for what that book will potentially be worth once it is graded, clean, pressed, and graded, you have the ability to evaluate whether the value of that book graded warrants the cost to have it clean, pressed, and encapsulated. Because that is a very important exercise for people to go through. If you send a book in that you have potentially misgraded and you believe it's a 9.8, and that book comes in at something other than a 9.8, and that book is essentially not worth this much money, you potentially will be upside down on that book, in the sense that the shipping, cleaning, pressing, grading, and shipping again back to you comes at a cost. And let's just say that cost is $50. And the value of that book graded at a 9.6 is $45. You are underwater. Thankfully, it's only a couple of bucks, but you are underwater. And in your mind, you knew that that book, that raw book, was a 9.8 worth $600, and it is now not worth $600. You are underwater on that particular book. That is a hard pill to swallow. But here's the thing, you don't have to swallow that pill if you learn how to grade your comics, if you learn how to objectively look at those comics, and then to evaluate honestly what that grade is, what that value is, and what the cost of getting that book graded will be. It puts you in a much better position to have some better outcomes on the other side when those books actually show up from whichever grading company you decide to use. And ideally, it actually puts you in a better place to have a more positive emotional experience and just experience overall, because you're going into the situation much more informed. You're going into the situation ahead of the curve, and so you will potentially emerge on the other side in a much better position than if you roll the dice and make some assumptions. And if you don't properly inspect what it is that you are actually doing. So I think that it's really important to do some of these things. And again, grading companies make mistakes. Grading companies make mistakes. This video is not about excusing any of that stuff, because when mistakes happen, because they do happen, it's important that the grading companies make it right as best they can, because there's a lot involved. There's a lot involved with this hobby of comics. And I think it's important that the grading companies do what they're supposed to do. But in that same vein, it's also important that we do our part as well. So I want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen to this recording. And the thing is there a bias towards non-9.8 books? Yes, there is. There is definitely a bias, but that bias doesn't mean that those books that are not 9.8s, it does not mean that those books are garbage. It does not mean that those books are worthless. That is not the case. And again, the emotions that we see play out on the screen are easily attributed to the dollars and cents and towards this bias. But I think that, as I've kind of spoken about over the course of this recording, that there are other things at play. There are other things at play besides the dollars and cents of it that might be why you see these expressions kind of play out on the screen. But yeah, there is definitely a bias. But like I said, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch this recording and to listen to this. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, I certainly want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button. If you want to mix it up in the comment section, leave a comment behind. Let's talk about this thing. Am I off base? Am I on track? What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about this? If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so in one of two ways: on Instagram at Regie Collects, or you can send me an email to Regie@regiecollects.com. Take care.